council chamber went silent the moment my father raised his hand and called for the execution of my husband. I stood between the throne and the man they had chained to the floor, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain the entire court could hear it. His name was Ren Calder, and 3 days ago he had been nothing more to me than a prisoner assigned to my side, a human soldier given to me in marriage as a punishment disguised as an honor. Now the High Council wanted him dead before sunset, and I did not even understand why. I am Zayara Vel Korith, daughter of the Ashen Reach Dominion, heir to a throne that has ruled 12 star systems for 10,000 years. My people do not fear anything. We do not bow to anyone. And yet, as I looked at the human kneeling before the council with his wrists bound in metal that could hold a war machine, I saw something in his eyes that unsettled me more than any weapon ever had. He was not afraid. He looked almost bored, as if this entire trial were a formality he had already lived through 100 times before. "He is charged with the destruction of Outpost Sylvain," my father said, his voice echoing across the marble hall. "An entire garrison of our soldiers erased in a single night, and this creature was the only one left standing among the ashes." I had heard the story before, whispered among the nobles like a ghost tale meant to frighten children. A lone human, unarmed and outnumbered 1,000 to 1, somehow walked away from a battlefield that swallowed an entire garrison. It sounded impossible. It sounded like propaganda meant to justify locking him away and forgetting he existed. But the council believed it, and belief was often more dangerous than truth. "Then let him speak," I said, surprising even myself with how steady my voice came out. "If he is guilty, let him explain himself before you take his life." My father's eyes narrowed at me, the same look he gave me whenever I stepped somewhere I was not supposed to. Marriages like mine were never meant to matter. They were leashes, nothing more, a way to remind conquered worlds that even their strongest sons could be tamed and displayed like trophies in our halls. I was never meant to care whether the leash lived or died, but I did care, and I did not yet understand why. Ren lifted his head slowly, meeting my father's gaze without flinching. "I did not attack your soldiers," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "I was protecting people who could not protect themselves. If your garrison fell, it was because they chose to fire first." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Nobody spoke to my father that way, not even other rulers. Yet Ren said it as though it were simply a fact, the way one might mention the weather. High Marshal Threx stepped forward before my father could respond, his armor gleaming under the chamber lights, his expression twisted with something between hatred and hunger. Threx had wanted my hand in marriage long before Ren arrived, and he had never forgiven me for the humiliation of being denied. Now he saw an opportunity, and I could see it sharpening behind his eyes like a blade being drawn. "Innocent men do not walk away from massacres unscratched," Threx said. "Look at him. Not a single wound, not a single burn. Either he is lying, or he is something far more dangerous than a soldier." The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, nobles shouting for judgment, others calling for patience, and beneath all of it, Ren remained still, watching the chaos with the calm of someone who had already decided how the story would end. I did not know what to believe. I only knew that something about the way the guards refused to look directly at him bothered me more than any accusation. I knew that the temple servitors, ancient machines that had not moved from their posts in centuries, had rerouted themselves the day he arrived, avoiding his wing of the palace entirely, as if his very presence offended something written into their oldest programming. I knew that when I passed an old oracle drone in the eastern corridor, it had murmured a name that was not Ren Calder at all, a name I did not recognize, spoken with something close to reverence. None of that was proof of guilt. None of it was proof of innocence either, but it was enough to make me stand in front of a chained prisoner and ask my father to wait. "Give me time," I said. "If he is truly the monster you believe him to be, I will hand him to you myself. But if he is not, then you are about to execute an innocent man in front of every noble house in the Dominion, and that mistake will follow our family for generations." My father studied me for a long moment, the silence stretching so thin I thought it might snap. Finally, he waved a hand, more out of exhaustion than mercy. "3 days," he said. "Find your proof, daughter, or I will finish what the council started." The guards dragged Ren away before I could speak to him, and I was left standing in the center of the chamber, with every eye in the room fixed on me, judging, calculating, wondering what game I was playing. I did not know myself. All I knew was that something about this quiet human, with tired eyes and an unshakable calm, did not fit the story the council wanted me to believe. That night, I went to see him in the chamber where they kept him, deep beneath the palace where sunlight never reached. He sat on the floor, with his back against the wall, the chains around his wrists glowing faintly with restraint energy strong enough to hold down a beast 3 times his size. He looked up when I entered, and for the first time, I saw something other than calm in his expression. I saw exhaustion, the kind that comes not from a single battle, but from carrying a weight for far too long. "You did not have to defend me," he said quietly. "I did not do it for you," I replied, though even as I said it, I was not entirely certain that was true. "I did it because I do not like being handed a story without asking why it was written that way." He almost smiled at that, a small, tired thing that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Careful, princess. Curiosity is not a popular trait in a place like this." "Neither is mercy," I said, "and yet here I am." We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint hum of the restraint chains. I studied him, searching for some sign of the monster the council described, some hint of the violence that had supposedly erased an entire garrison. I found none. What I found instead was a man who watched everything with quiet, careful attention, who chose his words like a soldier conserving ammunition, who seemed far more concerned with protecting something than proving himself innocent. "Tell me what happened at Sylvain," I finally said. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought he might refuse entirely. "Your soldiers found a group of civilians hiding near the outpost," he said at last. "Refugees, mostly children. They were not a threat. Your garrison decided otherwise. And you stopped them." "I tried to stop them from making a mistake they could never undo," he said. "I did not want anyone to die that night. Your people made that choice before I did." It was not a confession, and it was not quite a denial either. It was something more complicated, something that made the official story feel thinner with every word he spoke. I wanted to press further, to demand the details that would finally make sense of everything, but something in his eyes told me he had given me all he was willing to give for tonight. As I stood to leave, he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Whatever you find out about me, Zayara, I need you to understand something. I never wanted this. I never wanted to be a symbol, or a weapon, or a story people whisper about in fear. I just wanted my people to survive." I did not understand what he meant, not fully, not yet, but the way he said it, with a kind of tired honesty that no liar could fake, planted a question in my mind that would not leave me alone for the rest of the night. What if the council was not protecting the Dominion from a monster at all? What if they were protecting themselves from a truth they were not ready to face? I walked back through the palace corridors, long after midnight, past the ancient oracle drones that had gone silent again, past the temple guards who still would not meet my eyes when I mentioned his name. 3 days did not feel like enough time to answer the question that was forming inside me, a question far larger than whether one man was guilty or innocent. I was beginning to suspect that the real mystery was not what Ren Calder had done at Sylvain. It was what he was. The knife was already in the air when I turned around, and for half a heartbeat I understood exactly what it felt like to know I would not be fast enough to save myself. 2 days had passed since my father gave me his warning, and I had spent every hour of them searching for proof that Ren Calder was not the monster the council believed him to be. I had gone through restricted archives that had not been opened in decades, bribed a records keeper with promises I was not entirely sure I could keep, and pieced together a picture that made less and less sense the longer I studied it. And now, walking back from the archive wing with my mind full of unanswered questions, I found myself facing an assassin in the shadows of my own palace. I did not even see his face clearly before he moved. What I saw was Ren, stepping between us, with a speed that did not belong to any human I had ever studied, catching the assassin's wrist before the blade could reach me. There was no struggle, no strain in his expression, nothing that resembled effort at all. He simply stopped a killing strike as easily as someone might catch a falling cup, then turned to look at me with something close to concern, as if he were checking whether I had been frightened rather than celebrating that he had just saved my life. "Are you hurt?" he asked. I could not answer right away. My mind was too busy replaying what I had just seen, trying to make it fit inside the story I had been told about him. A war criminal who barely survived his own crimes. A prisoner, too dangerous to be trusted with freedom. Neither version explained a man who could disarm a trained killer without so much as raising his voice. The assassin did not stay to be questioned. He twisted free, dropped something small and metallic that hissed with smoke, and vanished into the darkness before the palace guards could respond. By the time soldiers arrived, all that remained was the faint smell of scorched air and my own racing heartbeat. "Someone wants me dead before the council can decide my fate themselves," Ren said quietly, watching the empty corridor where the assassin had disappeared. "That should tell you something." "It tells me you have enemies," I said. "It does not tell me why." He looked at me then, really looked, in a way that made me feel like he was deciding how much of the truth I could handle. "Some truths get people killed for knowing them," he said. "I would rather you stayed curious and alive than satisfied and in danger." I wanted to be angry at him for speaking to me like a child who needed protecting, but the assassin's blade was still fresh enough in my memory that I understood, at least partly, why he was cautious. Still, I was done accepting half answers. I had 3 days to save his life, and half answers were not going to be enough to convince a council that wanted him dead before sunset on principle alone. The following morning, I confronted High Marshal Threx in the training yards, where he was overseeing a squadron of soldiers with the kind of self-satisfied pride that made my skin crawl. He smiled when he saw me approaching, the expression sharp and calculated, like a predator that had already decided the outcome of the conversation before it began. "Come to beg for your husband's life again, Princess?" he asked. "I came to ask why the surveillance footage from Sylvain has been altered," I said, watching his expression carefully. "I have seen the original files, Marshal. Someone corrupted large sections of it before it ever reached the council." For the briefest moment, something flickered behind his eyes, gone before I could name it. "Footage from a war zone is often damaged," he said smoothly. "You should not read conspiracy into technical failure." "I would agree with you," I said, "if the damage was not concentrated so precisely around the moments where your soldiers opened fire first." His jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat I thought he might drop the pretense entirely. Instead, he laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You are letting a human charm you into questioning your own people, Zayara. That is dangerous for someone in your position." "I am letting evidence question a story that does not add up," I replied. "That is dangerous for someone in yours." I left him standing in the training yard, his composure cracked just enough to confirm what I had already begun to suspect. Threx knew more about Sylvain than he was willing to admit, and his eagerness to see Ren executed was not simply about justice, it was about silence. That evening, I returned to the chamber where Ren was held, carrying with me the fragments of truth I had gathered. I told him everything, the altered footage, Threx's reaction, the way certain nobles avoided the subject of Sylvain entirely, as though even discussing it might invite trouble upon their houses. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable until I finished. "You are getting closer to something you are not prepared for," he said finally. "Then prepare me," I said. I am tired of being handed pieces of a puzzle and told not to look at the picture they form." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the chains around his wrists, as though weighing how much longer he could keep them meaningful. "There are things about my people that your dominion does not know," he said slowly. "Things we have hidden for a long time, not out of pride, but out of fear of exactly what is happening to me right now. When strength becomes visible, it becomes a target. When a target becomes big enough, it becomes a threat that needs to be erased before it grows." "What kind of strength?" I asked. "The kind that would make your people very afraid," he said, "and very dangerous, if they ever decided fear was reason enough to strike first." I wanted to press further, but a sound at the door interrupted us, one of my father's personal guards arriving with a message that could not wait. The council had moved up the timeline. Instead of 3 days, I now had only until tomorrow evening to present my case, or Ren would be executed regardless of what proof I had or had not found. Panic rose in my chest, quick and sharp, but Ren's expression did not change at all. If anything, he looked almost relieved, as though a decision he had been avoiding had finally been made for him. "They are afraid," he said quietly, once the guard had gone. "That is why they are rushing this. Someone convinced your father that waiting is more dangerous than acting." "Threx," I said, the name leaving my mouth like a curse. "Perhaps," Ren said, "or perhaps something older than Threx is pulling strings none of us can see yet." That night, unable to sleep, I returned to the archives one final time, searching not for evidence about Sylvain, but for anything connected to the strange behavior I had witnessed since Ren's arrival. The Oracle drones avoiding him, the temple servitors rerouting their patrols, the name whispered in the eastern corridor that did not match the one on his prisoner records. Deep within a section of the archive that had not been accessed in centuries, sealed behind clearance levels reserved for the highest priesthood, I found a single fragment of scripture, faded and incomplete, describing a figure the old texts called something that translated roughly into the silent air. The description was vague, poetic in the frustrating way old religious texts often were, speaking of a humble form hiding immense power, a judge who would return not with armies, but with quiet mercy that could just as easily become quiet devastation. I stared at the fragment for a long time, my mind refusing to connect the dots, even as every instinct screamed that they were already connected. It was just a story, I told myself, an old myth, nothing more, the kind of tale every ancient civilization kept buried somewhere in its history to explain the things it could not otherwise understand. But myths did not make trained assassins hesitate before striking. Myths did not make Oracle drones reroute their patrols, and myths certainly did not catch a killing blade out of the air without so much as blinking. I closed the archive file slowly, my hands trembling slightly, though I could not have said whether it was from fear or something closer to wonder. Whatever Ren Calder truly was, I no longer believed he was simply a soldier who had survived a battle he should not have walked away from. I believed, for the first time, that the council was not afraid of a war criminal at all. They were afraid of something they did not have the words to name. The doors of the sanctum of the first choir had not opened for an outsider in over 300 years, and the moment they groaned apart to let Ren step through, every priest inside dropped to their knees as though the floor itself had ordered them to kneel. I had brought him there under heavy guard, using the excuse of a diplomatic blessing ceremony to buy myself a few more hours before the council's deadline arrived. I told myself I simply wanted to see how the oldest and most sacred order in the Dominion would react to him, hoping for some clue, some fragment of information I could carry back to the council as proof of his innocence. What I found instead was a room full of ancient priests, trembling with a fear so total it bordered on worship. "Silence," the eldest among them whispered, though nobody had spoken. He was staring at Ren, the way one might stare at a fire that had somehow learned to walk. The silent air walks among us again. I felt the floor shift beneath me, not literally, but in every sense that mattered. I had read that phrase only hours ago. Buried in a forbidden fragment of scripture, I had convinced myself was nothing more than an old myth. Hearing it spoken aloud by a priest who had clearly spent his entire life waiting for this exact moment made the myth feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. Ren's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a weariness settling over him that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "I am not here to be worshipped," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence of the chamber. "I am here because your princess wanted answers, and I am tired of giving her half of them." The eldest priest lifted his head slowly, tears gathering in eyes that had likely not wept in decades. "You do not understand what you are, do you? Or perhaps you understand too well, and that is why you hide." "Explain it to me then," I said, stepping forward before either of them could retreat further into riddles. "I have spent 2 days chasing shadows through this palace. I deserve more than half answers wrapped in old poetry." The priest gestured for us to follow him deeper into the sanctum, past murals so old their colors had faded into ghostly outlines, past statues of figures whose faces had been worn smooth by centuries of reverent hands. We arrived in a circular chamber at the heart of the temple, where a single scripture wall stood untouched by time, protected by fields of energy that shimmered faintly in the low light. "Long before the Dominion ruled the stars," the priest began, "long before our ancestors built the first ships that carried us beyond our homeworld, there existed an order that walked among the young civilizations of the galaxy. They did not conquer. They did not rule. They watched, and where they saw cruelty unchecked, they intervened, quietly, without armies, without conquest, simply removing the danger and leaving before anyone understood what had happened. And you believe Ren is one of them," I said, though it was less a question than a statement I was still struggling to accept. "We believe," the priest said carefully, "that the scripture describes a silent heir who would return in a humble form, hidden among a lesser species, judging not with armies, but with mercy, so absolute it could become devastating if provoked. We believed it was myth, a story meant to keep our ancestors humble. Until 3 of our oldest oracle systems that have not registered a single anomaly in over 1,000 years, began malfunctioning the moment this man arrived in our palace." I turned to Ren, searching his face for confirmation or denial, finding instead only that same tired patience I had grown used to seeing in him. "Is it true?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "My people call it something different," he said. "We do not call ourselves gods, or heirs, or judges. We call ourselves the last of an order that made a promise, a very long time ago, to protect the weak from the strong, even when the strong belonged to our own bloodline. Your priest's scripture is not entirely wrong. It is simply old and incomplete, the way most stories become after enough centuries have passed through enough mouths." "Then what happened at Sylvain?" I asked. "Tell me the truth this time, all of it." Ren looked at the priest, who gave a small, understanding nod and stepped back, granting us a privacy that felt strangely sacred within a room already thick with reverence. When Ren finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its careful control, revealing something rawer underneath. "Your garrison found refugees hiding near the outpost," he said. "Children mostly, along with a handful of adults trying to protect them. Your soldiers believed they were scouts for an enemy force and opened fire without confirming the threat. I was nearby, delivering aid to a colony your Dominion had already abandoned, and I arrived in time to stop the attack before it became a massacre." "Stop it how?" I asked, though some part of me already feared the answer. "I disabled their weapons," he said. "All of them, at once, without touching a single soldier. I did not want anyone to die that night, Zayara. Not your people, not the refugees. But your council needed a story that did not involve their own soldiers making a fatal mistake, so they built one around me instead. A lone human, somehow responsible for an entire garrison losing its weapons and its nerve in the same night. It was easier to call me a monster than to admit their own soldiers had nearly slaughtered innocent children. The chamber felt smaller suddenly, the weight of his words pressing down on me harder than any physical force could have. Everything I thought I understood about the Dominion's justice, about the war, about the husband I had been assigned as a political leash, had just been rewritten in front of me, and I was not entirely certain how to stand steady beneath the new shape of it. "Why did you not simply say this from the beginning?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Because the truth is more dangerous than the lie," he said. "A war criminal is something your people can execute and forget. A being capable of disarming an entire garrison without lifting a weapon is something they will either worship or hunt, and neither outcome ends well for anyone involved, especially not for you, standing beside me." I understood then the exhaustion I had seen in his eyes since the very first night in that cold, chained chamber. It was not the exhaustion of a soldier recovering from battle. It was the exhaustion of someone who had spent his entire life being too much for the world around him, forced to shrink himself into smaller, safer shapes just to survive among people who could not decide whether to fear him or use him. "I am not afraid of you," I said, and I realized as I said it that it was completely true. I do not think I ever was, not really. I think I have been afraid of what my people would do once they learned what you are. Something shifted in his expression then, a softness I had not seen before, fragile and unguarded in a way that felt more intimate than anything the council's ceremonies could have arranged for us. "I did not want this marriage," he admitted quietly. "I did not want to be handed to a princess as a trophy, made to perform obedience for a court that saw me as nothing more than a leash around your father's enemies. But somewhere between the chains and the questions you refused to stop asking, I began to want to stay, not because I have to, because I choose to." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing at all, standing in the quiet reverence of a temple that had waited centuries for a myth to walk through its doors, feeling for the first time that the man beside me was not a prisoner, or a weapon, or a story whispered in fear. He was simply a person, tired of hiding, finally allowed to be seen. The moment did not last as long as I wished it could have. A guard burst into the chamber, breathless, carrying news that shattered whatever fragile peace we had found. High Marshal Threx had convinced the council to move the tribunal forward immediately, using the temple visit itself as proof that Ren was manipulating the priesthood, twisting old superstition into a shield against justice. The council would gather within the hour, and this time there would be no more delays, no more extensions, no more chances to gather evidence in the shadows. "He wants a public spectacle," Ren said grimly, the softness from moments ago hardening back into the calm, calculated stillness I had first seen in him. "A tribunal in front of the entire court, where he can force me to either prove what I am or be executed as a fraud, hiding behind borrowed prophecy." "Then we give him what he wants," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "Not a fraud, not a monster, the truth, in front of everyone, before he can twist it into something it was never meant to be." Ren studied me for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his tired eyes. "The truth will change everything, Zayara. Your people's entire understanding of themselves, of their gods, of their place among the stars. Are you certain you are ready for that?" I thought of the council chamber, of my father's cold judgment, of Threx's hungry ambition, of the priests kneeling in trembling reverence before a man who had only ever wanted to protect the innocent. I thought of the 10,000 years of certainty my people had built their entire identity upon, and how close it now stood to crumbling. "No," I admitted, "but I am ready to stand beside you when it does." The eldest priest watched us leave the sanctum with an expression I could not fully read, somewhere between hope and grief, as though he understood better than either of us what was about to unfold within the walls of the council chamber. Behind us, the ancient scripture wall pulsed faintly in the dim light, as if the old prophecy itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether the silent air would finally be revealed, or whether fear would silence the truth once again before it ever had the chance to be heard. The council chamber had never been this full, not even on the day my father was crowned, and every single face in that crowd was turned toward the man standing at its center with his wrists finally free of chains. High Marshal Threx had insisted on that detail, wanting Ren unbound so that no one could later claim the tribunal had been unfair. So certain was he that the truth would destroy Ren without any need for restraints. I stood beside my father's throne, my heart pounding so loudly I feared the entire room could hear it, watching Threx pace in front of the gathered nobles like a predator finally closing in on wounded prey. "Let the record show," Threx announced, his voice carrying easily through the silent chamber, "that this creature has spent the last 2 days manipulating our oldest priesthood into believing old superstition, twisting fear into false reverence, to escape the justice he so clearly deserves." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nobles nodding in agreement, others glancing nervously toward the small delegation of priests who had come from the sanctum to witness the tribunal themselves. The eldest priest stood among them, his expression calm, despite the tension thick enough to choke on, as though he already knew how this story would end. "Speak, human," my father commanded, his voice heavy with the weight of a decision he clearly did not want to make. "Prove your innocence, or accept your judgment." I watched Ren straighten, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw him fully release the careful restraint he had carried like armor since the moment they dragged him into the palace. It was not violent, it was not even dramatic in the way the council seemed to expect. It was simply presence, quiet and absolute, the kind of stillness that made every torch in the chamber seem to dim slightly by comparison. "I did not manipulate your priesthood," he said, his voice calm, but carrying easily to every corner of the vast chamber. "Your priesthood recognized something your council has spent centuries trying to forget. I am not here to prove my innocence through argument. I am here to show you the truth you have been too afraid to face." Threx laughed, sharp and mocking, though something uncertain flickered behind his confidence. "And what truth is that? That you are some forgotten god come to judge us? Spare us the theater, human. Show us proof, or accept the blade." Ren's gaze shifted, not to Threx, not even to my father, but to the small delegation of priests standing near the chamber's edge. He said nothing at all. He simply stood there, calm and still, and the ancient oracle relic that the priests had carried with them, a device older than the Dominion's written records, began to glow with a light none of us had ever seen it produce before. The eldest priest gasped, dropping to his knees immediately, followed a heartbeat later by every other member of the delegation, their reverent murmurs filling the chamber like a wave rolling inevitably toward the shore. My father rose from his throne, his composure cracking for the first time since I had known him, watching in stunned silence as the ancient relic that had remained dormant for centuries pulsed with recognition in the presence of a single, unassuming man. "This is not proof," Threx snapped, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "This is a trick, some device he has tampered with to fool old men desperate for meaning." "It is not a trick," the eldest priest said, his voice trembling with something far beyond fear. "I have studied this relic my entire life. It has not activated once, not in 300 years of my service, not in the centuries before me. It only wakes for one presence, described in scripture so old most scholars believed it was pure allegory. It wakes for the silent air." The chamber fell into chaos, voices rising over one another, some nobles crying out in disbelief, others falling into stunned silence, the entire foundation of everything the Dominion believed about its own gods and its own history beginning to crack open in front of everyone present. Threx, sensing his advantage slipping away entirely, drew his weapon in a final, desperate act, lunging toward Ren with a speed meant to end the confrontation before it could unravel any further. I screamed a warning, but it was unnecessary. Ren moved without any visible effort at all, catching Threx's wrist mid-strike, exactly as he had done with the assassin days earlier, disarming him with a gentleness that felt almost like mercy, though the message beneath it was unmistakable. He could have ended Threx's life in that same instant. He chose not to. "I told you once already," Ren said quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos with an authority that needed no volume to command the room. "I do not want to be your god. I do not want to be your weapon. I only wanted the truth spoken honestly, for once, in a chamber that has spent far too long hiding behind convenient lies." The relic's glow intensified briefly before settling into a soft, steady pulse, and one by one, the priests began to speak the old scripture aloud, words I had only read as fragments in forbidden archives, now filling the chamber like a hymn centuries overdue. The silent air would return not with armies, but with mercy, and where the powerful had grown cruel in his absence, he would remind them, gently, that mercy could just as easily become judgment if pushed too far. My father stood frozen at the edge of his throne, staring at the man his own counsel had nearly executed, staring at a truth that unraveled 10,000 years of certainty in the space of a single tribunal. I watched him struggle, watched the proud, unshakable ruler I had known my entire life search desperately for some way to reclaim control of a narrative that had already slipped entirely beyond his grasp. "What do you want from us?" my father finally asked, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of all its usual command. "I want what I have always wanted," Ren said, "for your soldiers to think twice before they open fire on the innocent, for your counsel to seek truth before convenience, and for the woman standing beside your throne to no longer be treated as a leash for your political ambitions, but respected as someone whose judgment proved far wiser than the entire chamber surrounding her." Every eye in the room turned toward me then, and I felt the weight of that attention settle over me like armor I had never asked to wear. 3 days ago, I had stood in this very chamber, pleading for time to prove one man's innocence. Now I stood at the center of a revelation that would reshape everything my people believed about their place among the stars, and I understood, with sudden and absolute clarity, that there was no version of my life that returned to what it had been before. Threx, humiliated and exposed, tried one final, desperate gambit, shouting accusations of treason, demanding the guards seize Ren regardless of what the relic had shown. But the guards, who had watched everything unfold with their own eyes, hesitated, then slowly, one by one, lowered their weapons instead of raising them. Whatever authority Threx believed he still commanded had evaporated the moment ancient gods, or whatever truth lay beneath that title, had knelt before a man he called a criminal. "Take the marshal into custody," my father said finally, his voice heavy but steady, the decision of a ruler choosing, at last, to follow truth rather than comfortable fiction. "His manipulation of the Sylvain records will be investigated fully, and this tribunal is concluded." The chamber erupted once more, though this time the chaos carried a different energy entirely, something closer to awe than fear, closer to reckoning than judgment. I moved through the crowd toward Ren, ignoring the stares, ignoring the whispered questions already forming around us, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. When I reached him, he looked down at me with an expression I had not seen since our quiet conversation in the sanctum, something soft beneath the exhaustion, something that looked almost like relief. "You did not have to defend me the first time," he said quietly, echoing words I had spoken to him days earlier in a cold, chained chamber. "Yet you did it anyway." "I told you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I do not like being handed a story without asking why it was written that way." For the first time since I had known him, Ren Calder smiled, not the small, tired thing I had glimpsed before, but something full and unguarded, the smile of a man finally allowed to stop hiding after a lifetime of shrinking himself for the comfort of others. Around us, the chamber continued to churn with disbelief and reckoning, priests still murmuring old scripture, nobles still arguing over what they had just witnessed, my father staring at the ancient relic as though it held answers to questions he had never thought to ask. But standing there, beside the man the gods themselves had recognized, none of that chaos felt as important as the quiet certainty settling into my chest. Whatever came next, whatever reckoning the Dominion faced in the days ahead, I would not face it as a princess handed a political leash. I would face it standing beside my husband, finally seen for exactly who he was. The morning after the tribunal, I woke to find half the palace already rearranging itself around a truth it did not yet know how to hold. Servants whispered in corridors that had been silent for years. Nobles who once avoided our wing of the palace entirely now lingered near its entrance, hoping for a glimpse of the man their ancient relic had recognized. Even the guards who once refused to meet Ren's eyes now stood a little straighter when he passed, though whether from respect or lingering unease, I could not always tell. 10,000 years of certainty did not unravel quietly, and the days following the tribunal proved that truth again and again. My father summoned me to his private chambers before the sun had fully risen, his expression heavier than I had ever seen it, the weight of an empire's entire history pressing down on him in a way no council session ever had. He did not speak for a long moment after I entered, simply staring out at the sprawling city beyond his window, as though searching for answers written somewhere in its ancient streets. I built my rule on the belief that the Dominion stood above every other species among the stars, he said finally, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. Yesterday, that belief knelt before a man I nearly executed on a lie manufactured by my own marshal. "It is not weakness to admit you were wrong," I said carefully, unsure whether the words would comfort him or wound him further. "It is only weakness to keep pretending otherwise once the truth is standing in front of you." He turned to look at me then, something unfamiliar in his gaze, a kind of respect I had rarely seen him offer anyone, let alone his own daughter. "You saw what I refused to see," he admitted. "You asked questions I was too proud to ask myself. Perhaps the throne would be safer in hands willing to question the stories it is told." I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, though the words settled somewhere deep inside me, a seed of possibility I had never before allowed myself to consider. For the first time in my life, my father was not simply issuing commands. He was thinking aloud, uncertain, human in a way rulers of the Dominion were never meant to be. The investigation into Threx moved swiftly once it began, uncovering exactly what I had suspected during our confrontation in the training yards. He had known about the altered surveillance footage from Sylvain, had personally ordered certain sections corrupted to hide the truth of his own soldiers opening fire on innocent refugees. His ambition to see Ren executed had never truly been about justice. It had been about silencing a truth that threatened his own carefully built reputation, and about eliminating a rival for a marriage he still believed should have been his bin. He was stripped of his rank and confined to await formal judgment, and though some nobles argued for leniency given his years of service, I found myself with little sympathy left to offer a man who had been willing to execute an innocent life to protect his own ambition. Ren, surprisingly, argued for a measure of mercy in his sentencing, a request that confused half the court until he explained his reasoning in a quiet conversation we shared later that evening. "Cruelty answered with cruelty only teaches the next generation that cruelty is the correct response," he said, sitting beside me on the balcony that overlooked the city. The chains that once bound his wrists, now nothing more than a memory neither of us cared to revisit. "Justice should correct, not merely punish. If your Dominion wants to grow beyond the mistakes that nearly cost me my life, it needs to prove that even in the face of betrayal, it can choose wisdom over vengeance." I studied him for a long moment, the city lights reflecting softly in his tired eyes, and I understood, more fully than I had before, exactly what kind of man had been hidden beneath the label of war criminal for so long. He was not a god seeking worship, nor a weapon seeking purpose. He was simply someone who had spent his entire life trying to make the world around him a little gentler, a little safer, even when that world repaid him with chains and suspicion. "You could have told them everything from the very beginning," I said. "You could have avoided so much of what happened these past few days." "Perhaps," he said, "but truth revealed too quickly is rarely believed, and truth forced upon people who are not ready for it often becomes a weapon instead of a gift. I needed you to ask the right questions, Zayara, not because I doubted my own innocence, but because I needed your people to arrive at the truth themselves, rather than simply being told what to believe by the very being they feared." It was, I realized, exactly the kind of patience that had allowed an entire ancient order to remain hidden among the stars for centuries, quietly protecting the vulnerable without ever demanding recognition for their sacrifice. It explained the exhaustion I had seen in his eyes since our very first conversation, the weight of centuries spent shrinking himself into smaller, safer shapes for a galaxy not yet ready to understand what he truly was. In the weeks that followed, the Dominion began the slow, uncertain process of redefining its relationship with humanity entirely. Diplomats who had once treated human worlds as little more than resources to exploit now approached negotiations with a caution bordering on reverence, uncertain how many other quiet protectors might be hidden among a species they had so thoroughly underestimated. Scholars descended upon the ancient sanctum in droves, desperate to study scripture they had dismissed as myth for centuries, searching for any clue about the true scope of the order Ren had once belonged to. Ren remained patient through all of it, answering what questions he could, deflecting others with the same careful restraint I had come to recognize as protection rather than deception. He never claimed to be a god, no matter how many priests knelt before him, no matter how many scholars begged him to confirm one theory or another about ancient prophecy. He simply continued being exactly what he had always insisted he was, a man who wanted peace more than power, and safety more than worship. One evening, several weeks after the tribunal, I found him standing alone in the gardens outside our private quarters, staring up at the stars with an expression I had rarely seen on him, something quieter than exhaustion, closer to peace. I joined him without a word, and for a long while we simply stood together beneath the vast, glittering sky that had once felt so foreign to me, and now felt like the beginning of something neither of us had expected to find. "Do you regret it?" I asked eventually. "Being discovered? Losing whatever peace came from hiding for so long?" He considered the question carefully before answering, the way he considered most things, as though every word carried weight he refused to spend carelessly. "I regret that it took a tribunal and nearly losing my life to be seen honestly," he said. "But I do not regret that you were the one who saw me first, long before the relic ever glowed, long before the priests ever knelt. You asked questions no one else was brave enough to ask, Zayara. That mattered more than any prophecy." I felt something warm settle in my chest, something I had not expected to feel when I was first assigned a prisoner as a punishment disguised as marriage. What began as a political arrangement designed to humiliate a defeated enemy had become something neither the Council nor I could have predicted, a partnership built not on power or fear, but on the simple, stubborn insistence on asking why, even when everyone around us preferred convenient silence. "I am not a princess who married a god," I said quietly, reaching for his hand. "I am a woman who married a man willing to protect strangers even when it cost him everything, and who finally let someone stand beside him instead of shielding her from the truth." He smiled at that, the same full, unguarded smile I had seen for the first time in the chaos of the tribunal chamber, and for a while we said nothing more at all, content simply to stand together beneath a sky that held far more mysteries than either of us had ever imagined. But peace, I had learned, rarely lasted long in a galaxy built on ancient secrets and fragile alliances. A few nights later, a message arrived from a neighboring empire we had only ever known through cautious trade agreements and distant diplomatic formalities, a message that spoke of old scripture within their own culture, whispers of prophecy, long dismissed as myth, now suddenly relevant again, in light of what had happened within the Dominion's own council chamber. They wished to send envoys, the message explained, eager to learn more about the silent heir now living quietly within our palace walls. And theirs was not the only message. Within days, similar inquiries arrived from empires scattered across a dozen different systems, each one carrying the same cautious curiosity, the same barely hidden anticipation, as though a truth long buried across the entire galaxy had finally begun to stir awake. Ren read each message with the same quiet patience he brought to everything, though I noticed a familiar weariness settling back into his shoulders, the weight of a galaxy slowly waking up to a truth he had spent his entire life trying to keep hidden for humanity's protection. When I asked him what it meant, he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "It means Earth is no longer as invisible as it once was," he said. "Whatever peace my people built by staying hidden may not last much longer." I reached for his hand again, steadier this time, no longer the frightened princess who once stood between her husband and an executioner's blade without fully understanding why. "Then we will face it together," I said, "the way we faced everything else, honestly and without hiding behind convenient silence." He looked at me then, and though I could see the uncertainty of everything still to come reflected in his tired eyes, I saw something else there too, something steady and unshaken beneath all of it. Hope, perhaps, or simply the quiet strength of someone who no longer had to carry the weight of secrecy entirely alone. Outside our window, the ancient city of my ancestors continued its slow, uncertain transformation, priests still murmuring rediscovered scripture, scholars still debating the true scope of an order the galaxy had long dismissed as myth, and somewhere far beyond our sky, other empires were beginning to wonder just how much they truly understood about the quiet, unassuming species they had spent centuries underestimating. I did not know what challenges waited for us beyond the horizon, what other ancient prophecies might stir awake now that one had finally been proven true. But I knew, standing beside the man the gods themselves had knelt before, that whatever came next, I would not face it as a princess handed a political leash, nor as a bystander watching history unfold from a safe distance. I would face it as his equal, his partner, and the one person in the entire Dominion who had never needed a prophecy to know exactly who he truly was.